Alright, so let's talk about money. Money in international context. This and the next lecture will be about international financial systems and international currency exchange rates and all that kind of stuff. And without any further ado, I would like to ask you a question. Imagine that you somehow have access to the information that will be displayed on the internet over the next year. In other words, let's say you know, or you have a way of knowing the exchange rate of different currencies of the world at any given second over the next year. The question is, how much money, or what would be the return on investment if you were to use that information to buy and sell currencies and basically try to make money on the currency market? If you're not sure what the return on investment rates are today, well, if you put your money in a savings account, you would expect to get anywhere between 1 to 3% per year. It used to be a little higher than that, but again, today money is cheap, and so normally you wouldn't get more than 3% with your regular savings account. If you put your money in a term deposit, you can probably get somewhat better return, somewhere up to 5%. If you buy bonds over long term, you can get anywhere between 3 to 7%. And if you buy and sell stocks, again depending on the market, but overall in the long run you can probably expect anywhere between 8% to 10% a year, plus or minus 10. So in some years you will lose, in some years you will gain, but overall it's going to be around 8%. Now if you were to put your money in currencies and you were buying the ones that go up in value and selling the ones that go down, how much, provided that you have perfect information about exchange rates at any given second, how much would you expect to make over, let's say, a year? Most of my students say that they would make anywhere between 15 to 20%, some say 10. But the reality is that currency rates, exchange rates fluctuate so wildly that you could probably make thousands and thousands percent in return on your investment, and maybe even over a few years, depending on how much money you start with, you can be definitely a billionaire. Let me give you just one example of a graph. This is an exchange rate graph for the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. As you see, in the long term, the rate has changed dramatically. So for example, in 2003, the exchange rate was around 65%, 65 cents Canadian, American for one Canadian dollar. As you can see, over 4 years, the exchange rate increased to 105, which gives you roughly 10 to 15% increase per year. But if you look at, for example, the exchange rate increase over 2007 to 2008, there was a 20% increase over this period alone. And then you could also see a change of about 20% literally overnight in September of 2008. That's, by the way, the time when I was scheduled to go to the United States, and obviously I had all my money in Canadian dollars at that time, and so effectively overnight I lost like 20% of all my wealth. But then again, as you can see, the currencies fluctuate, exchange rates fluctuate wildly within a given day, and so here we have a long graph, so you don't really see the fluctuations at any given minute, but even here you see that there is an increase and decrease of 2% every time. So if you were selling at each low point and buying at each high point, vice versa, buying at each low point and selling at each high point, you can see that you could easily make tens if not hundreds of percents in a matter of months. And then again, frequently currency exchange rates fluctuate several percent a day. It's not unusual to see that today the American dollar gained 1 or 2% or lost 1 or 2%. And so that's effectively 1 or 2% return on investment that you could make in that given day, and sometimes in that given hour. And if you multiply the number of days or hours in a year, you could see that you can easily make thousands of percents on return. Now the point here is that it's not really that you can make a lot of money. The point here is that currency rates fluctuate wildly and a lot. And so the question becomes, first, what predicts the currency exchange rate? And second, what do you do when you have to do business in an uncertain environment where you don't know what your money will be worth on the international market tomorrow? So those are the big questions for this and the next lecture. Now, in terms of capital market, I assume you understand the basics of the capital market. You have some people who have too much money and some people who have too little money. And so those people who have too much money don't know what to do with it, and they want to make more money on their money. So they're looking for people who want to borrow their capital and pay some interest rates on those loans. At the same time, people who have no money and need them are looking for someone to lend them the money, and so they're willing to pay the interest rate for those loans. And so the capital market, in its very simple basic idea, is that it moves the money from those who have excess capital to those who have need in capital. But then at the same time, those who borrow the money or get the money in some other form pay interest or dividends to those who lend the money. And so that's the very basic idea. It becomes a little bit more complicated when you have international context, especially if you think about how you can obtain capital. So there are two main ways to get money if you need it. And I wonder if you would know those two ways. Well, if you're listening to this, you're probably looking at the screen as well, and so the answer is right there. So one, you can borrow the money, or as we call it, issue debt. So basically you just, let's say you need $1 million or $1, and you borrow that money and you promise to return it at some time, and there would be some interest associated with that loan. So you would promise that you borrow $1, but you will return back, let's say, $1.10 in 1 year. An alternative way to obtain capital would be to issue equity. In other words, you have a brilliant idea for a company, and you expect to make millions of dollars on that brilliant idea. What you do is, rather than borrowing money, you're in a sense selling part of your company or part of your idea, and you say, whoever gives me $100 will own 1% of my company, and when the company becomes worth millions of dollars, you will then also own millions of dollars, because your $100 will still represent 1% of the company, which at that time may represent millions of dollars. If you've seen the Facebook, the social network movie, there are a couple of interesting stories there. One is that in the early stages, Mark Zuckerberg was trying to raise any capital, and rather than borrowing the money, he was basically selling parts of his company. And so many many people, especially co-founders of the company that at that time joined, either with their efforts and ideas or sometimes with some capital investments, now are basically billionaires, because the 5% of the company that they bought into at that time, several years ago, today are worth billions of dollars. You probably have also heard that story about a guy somewhere in Boston who claims that he lent Mark Zuckerberg, I believe it was like $8,000, and that was like month two of Facebook. And so apparently he claims that at that time Zuckerberg said that that $8,000 would be worth half of what became Facebook. And unfortunately for the guy, he couldn't prove that he lent that money, and so chances are he just made up that story. But had that been true, for a few dollars invested in a company in the early stages of the company life, one can literally become a billionaire just a few years later. Now the truth obviously is that most companies, most startups fail, and so investing money in startups will likely lead to you losing the money on most of those investments. But again, Facebook or Google or something of that kind comes along once in a while, and so you make up for all those losses in other ventures, and so become rich that way. So, but anyway, the main two types: borrow money as a loan, or borrow money as, in exchange for shares of the company. Now, you probably also understand that there are two types of banks: commercial banks and investment banks. And so commercial banks are the ones that deal with people. Basically, they borrow money from people. Every time you open a savings account or a checking account, you give the money to the bank, and then the bank gives that money to those who need the money in the form of loans. Investment banks, on the other hand, find or solicit money from those who have excess cash, and invest that money in businesses, so essentially buy shares and other forms of financial instruments. So rather than dealing with personal loans and that kind of stuff, investment banks invest money in ventures and other forms of financial investment. Now, It becomes very interesting once you move to the international arena. Uh, the financial markets, as we described them, work very well in the domestic context, but the picture becomes increasingly complicated when you cross the border. And so, first, the question would be, well, why would you want to go international? Why not, for example, if you need the money or money, why not go to a local bank and borrow the money that you need from a local bank, get a loan, or maybe find a local venture capitalist and try to convince him to buy part of your startup or your company. So why would you want to borrow money internationally? That's question one. Question two is, if you are a financial institution, the same question arises. Why would you want to lend money internationally? Why not take the money that you have in your coffins, and why not give it to local entrepreneurs or local private citizens who may be needing the money to buy a house or maybe expand their business? So why would you want to borrow or lend money internationally? And so obviously there are all kinds of pros for both borrowers and lenders. The biggest thing is that for borrowers, if you are borrowing money internationally, you have more options. What if the local banks don't want to give you the money because they feel that you don't have, I don't know, enough credit history? Or what if they are willing to give you the money, but the interest rates that they want to charge are too high for you? There is a very good chance if you go international, you may find a bank somewhere in, let's say, Pakistan or maybe Canada that would be willing to give you more money at a lower price. Maybe because they feel that American market is more stable than what they have there, and perhaps they feel that it would be a safe investment to give the money to you and would be willing to give it at a lower interest rate. Also, once the market becomes international, as you understand, there are more banks competing for for giving you the loan. And so the more competition, the better the price for the consumer. So you, as a borrower, are effectively a consumer of the bank services. And so the more banks are competing for your attention, the better the conditions, the better the price for you. So that's obviously your advantage. But then the same thing for lenders. If they want to lend money internationally, all of a sudden they have many more potential borrowers. And perhaps some borrowers may be in somewhere in Pakistan or Ukraine or Canada are willing to pay higher interest rates. For example, interest rates in the United States today are close to zero actually. So a house loan, 30-year mortgage, you can get it probably for 3.5%, and maybe even lower if you go with a shorter term. Now, the interest rates in, for example, Europe are substantially higher. And in some countries like Ukraine, they may be reaching 20 to 30% annual. So a bank here in the United States that is willing to take the risk and lend money to people in other countries may be getting much, much higher returns on their investment, on their loans. And so by going international, banks can make much more money on what they're doing, lending money. Plus, again, there may be also some borrowers in other countries that are more reliable, or perhaps have better credit history, or perhaps have other things that you like, maybe have better assets that you can put against the loan. And so obviously for you, you have all of a sudden a wider pool of potential applicants for loans, and you can choose the ones that you feel are more likely to repay the debt in time and then pay higher interest for your money. And then obviously you might want to diversify your risks. If you are a bank and all your borrowers are from Greensboro, something goes wrong, a company closes here, or I don't know, some kind of crisis, again, just like what the tobacco industry or furniture industry or textile industry experienced, and you basically are a bankrupt. If you have some loans though held or issued to people overseas, well, something goes terribly wrong in the United States, you're still collecting paychecks or payments from other countries. And so by diversifying your risks, you can make it more stable for your business. Now here is a question for you that you are likely to see in the exam. And this question is, which of the following is not true? And the correct answer is all of these statements are true. Now, as you can imagine, financial markets have internationalized dramatically in the past several decades. Today, you can probably buy financial instruments overseas from the comfort of your chair as you watch this lecture. If you have your iPad, iPhone on, or your computer on, you can probably buy shares of companies in China as we speak in these several minutes. You can definitely open an account in a bank overseas easily within minutes. You can probably open a savings account and start, in a sense, lending your money to banks overseas. Or if you want to issue a loan, borrow money from a bank overseas, again, you can probably apply for a loan and get one within, again, a few minutes, maybe a few hours, depending on the size of of the loan that you want. And so that you can do it all from the comfort of your room without ever having to go to a foreign company. And so obviously information technology that makes that possible. 50 years ago, if you wanted to, let's say, buy shares of a company in, let's say, France, what you would need to do, you would literally need to put your money in a bag, get on a boat, go to France, meet with the bankers or maybe company owners there, pay your money, get the papers that show that you bought the shares, or open an account or whatever else you want to do with your money, and then come back. So it was very difficult to do from the technical point of view, and very few people actually engaged in cross-border investments. Today, it's much easier to do it from the technical point of view, as well as due to deregulation. Just a few years ago, such operations would be illegal in most countries. Today, yes, there are still some restrictions. Yes, opening accounts in foreign countries may not be as easy as it looks, at least in some countries. But overall, it's fairly easy to do from the legal perspective. As long as you're willing to do it, there would be normally no laws that prevents you from doing it. Though there may be some regulations and little caveats that may make it not as easy, but definitely doable. And then obviously, as the market internationalizes, banks come up with new and new financial instruments, often specifically designed for the international context. So that makes it much easier to buy those financial instruments, and you don't have to kind of go local to sell or buy capital in a foreign country. So there may be instruments that would specifically be designed for example, Americans buying French shares. Now, I would like to talk now a little bit about the offshore financial centers before we talk about all the other things. You probably know or understand that international financial markets are often associated with tax evasion. And so some countries, especially small island nations, are specifically designed, or I guess one of the main revenue sources for them is the capital that comes from foreign jurisdictions. And so such countries like, for example, Monaco, Panama, Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, Bermudas, Bahamas, much of the money that the country receives is actually those investments by foreigners, in many cases in anonymous accounts that the tax haven kind of gets to use, so the interest rates they pay on those investments may be fairly generous, but then at the same time they would be charging no taxes on those investments, and so that would be a mutually beneficial proposition. So the investors escape paying taxes, but the tax havens get to use their money for some time, and so by doing so they can make more profits. And so the first question that I have is whether or not you think tax havens are good for America or bad for America. And I'm not sure what you're saying here, but most students normally say that tax havens hurt America because dishonest people, hide their assets or money in those tax havens and don't pay the taxes. Others say, well, that actually may help. And the idea here is that if you believe in lower taxes, then tax evasion, that's precisely what you basically advocate. And yes, the problem is that the most dishonest ones tend to be the ones who get a lower tax break. Get a tax break and pay a lower tax rate. But overall, I guess it's still good for the economy because people have more money left in their pockets, and as a result, if you believe that lower taxes stimulate the economy, that's more or less what the tax havens do. And obviously, I'm stretching the truth here, so obviously we don't want lower taxes to to those who are willing to cheat and higher taxes for those who are not. But again, economy-wide, that's what pretty much the outcome is according to those who support the idea of tax havens. I'll get to this slide again in a minute. Let me show you a video about tax havens, a very short one, about 5 minutes, and then we'll talk some more about it. So let me tell you a little about tax havens and their history. Tax havens are probably as old as taxes themselves. The idea originated in ancient Greece. At that time, Greece was pretty much a collection of city-states. And since Greece has access to the sea, it was a very much trading country. And plus, because it's on the crossroads, Asia on the one hand, Muslim world on the one hand, Europe on the other, or to the other side. So many financial and streams have been going through Greece, as well as many products and services were going through Greece. And so some city-states quickly figured out that they could make money at offering the traders better financial incentives or environment. Most of the city-states where the exchanges have been happening, basically the markets were located where people would come and exchange their goods, were charging some taxes for basically entering the city and displaying your merchandise on the market, on the street market at that time, I guess. And so some of the smaller city-states said, well, if you come and try to trade here, or if you want to enter the country through our port, we will charge you a lower tax or a lower import tariff. And so that was the main idea, and so basically they were competing in offering better financial incentives to the potential customers. Then obviously the idea was taken a bit further, and so such countries like, for example, Switzerland made a lot of money last century on offering anonymity to the clients who would be investing money in the banks of the country. Like, for example, the First World War, and even more so the Second World War, when Europe was burning in all those conflicts, and obviously many people who had lots of money were worried about losing their capital. What Switzerland was offering at that time was this: we will remain neutral, we will not participate in the war, let everything else burn around us, but we will remain an island of stability. If you bring and invest your money in our banks, we will not tell anyone that you put your money here. We will not ask you where you got the money, whom you robbed to get the money. And so whenever this war is over, we will have that money waiting for you, and you will get back to your wealthy existence. And that's what they did. They didn't participate in the war. They were one of a few countries in the world at that time that were not destroyed during the First or Second World War. And so they did offer perfect anonymity and protection to their clients. And so many, like Nazi Party in Germany investors, or many Russians, for example, the royal family members in the First World War, and then other questionable individuals in the Second World War, invested lots of money in Swiss banks, and their identity was never revealed at any time to anyone. And so that security, as well as coupled with low and favorable taxes on investment gains, capital gains, as well as other financial incentives, made Switzerland, as well as other countries of this type, a desirable destination for investment for many people, particularly those who have reasons to hide their assets, either from taxes or for perhaps even from criminal prosecution. If it's good or bad, well, I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying that this is what the countries do. And an important thing is that it's not even that tax havens are created for tax evasion. The thing is that there are today there are many individuals and many companies that are what we call born global. Right? Well, for example, you are born in the United States likely, and you probably plan to spend the rest of your life here, and you consider this country your home. And Yum Yum here that I see from my window, the company, it's an American company that operates in America and only in America. But there are many companies these days, as well as many individuals, who basically are cosmopolitan. I mean, Google arguably is not really an American company. I mean, these guys are all around the world. they have employment around the world, they have customers around the world, and so many companies are created with this global perspective in mind, and they don't want to be tied to a specific country, to specific geography. They're beyond that stage, just like many of their founders are. Yes, I mean, so what? They were born in one country, but I mean, they just end up traveling from one country to another. And so for those born globals, either individuals or companies, even more so companies, they don't want to be tied to a specific geographic location that charges them a high tax because they don't really use that geographic location that much. And so for many of them, all these so-called tax havens are a perfect place to start a business. Just like some celebrities, for example, would be officially living on a boat that just, always between the countries and pays taxes to no one. So that kind of residence allows you not to pay taxes to a specific country, particularly because you may not be living in that country that much after all. So in fact, many American celebrities, even though they are American and even though they may live mainly in America, but they probably spend a better half of the year outside the country all around the world, and so they just feel that paying taxes in one country in which you may spend only a few days a year just doesn't make sense to them. And again, is it ethical? Is it moral? Well, I'm not here to judge, and you probably also are in no position to judge. This is just the reality of the globalized world. And so for countries like this, I mean companies like this, where people like this starting directly and being always tied financially only to so-called tax havens makes perfect sense. And who knows, you may be one of those individuals. You may have a successful international business one day, business that you will envision as an international business from day one, and because you will be present equally in different countries, you may feel that you don't want to make one kind of real country like the United States or Germany your home, because I mean you will be here, that will be only a small part of where you live and where you do business, and so at that stage maybe tax havens will not look so bad to you. Plus, in addition, tax havens are not necessarily evil and definitely are not illegal. You definitely can have accounts overseas, including in Switzerland or Liechtenstein or the Virgin Islands. I, for example, have my accounts still in Canada, and it's perfectly fine, perfectly legal. If you go on study abroad, let's say to Germany, and open an account there, no problem there at all. The problem is that if you gain capital on your investments overseas and don't pay taxes on them, that's illegal. America has tax treaties with most countries in the world, and so you will likely be allowed to pay taxes either here in the United States or in the country where you gained capital, your choice. But somewhere you will have to pay the taxes, and if there is no tax treaty, you may actually have to pay taxes in both countries. So and the way it works is the following. For example, I have my accounts, as I said, in Canada, and I don't have much money there, but I don't know, just a couple $1,000s. But at the end of each year, my Canadian bank, TD Canada, Trust Dominion Canada, sends me one of those W something forms that shows how much money I had in my account and how much interest I earned. And with the money that I have, I earn like $20 a year or something like that, probably even less than that this time. But when I file my taxes here in the United States, I add that piece of paper and I show that, by the way, I made $20 on my investment in Canadian bank. And then I would be just basically adding that to my taxable income and pay taxes on that amount just like I would if it was an American bank. And again, I would have a choice because Canada and the United States has a treaty, tax treaty. I would have a choice where I would like to pay my taxes in Canada or in the United States, and I choose to do it in the United States just because it's simpler for me at this time, not necessarily because the taxes are lower here. But so again, if I wanted to do it in Canada, it's perfectly fine, and as long as I do pay my taxes on those capital gains, I'm fine. It becomes illegal if I, let's say, make lots of money, interest, for example, on my investment in Canada or the Virgin Islands or wherever else, and never pay taxes on those investments. That's when the problem arises. But it would be exactly the same story if you earned some money here in the United States and didn't pay taxes on those investment income. And so the government doesn't have problem with you having cash in Switzerland. The government has the problem with you having cash in Switzerland, making money on those investments, but not paying your taxes here in the United States, or again, if there is a treaty in Switzerland. And so that's when the problem arises. But overall, as I said, it's not illegal, it's perfectly fine. Many of you may at some time want to open those accounts overseas. If the interest rates are better overseas, or there are other incentives or financial goodies that you can get from a bank there. It's perfectly fine. You're entitled and allowed to shop around and get the best rates. Just like you may choose the best bank for yourself in the United States, nobody prevents you from using the same strategy and search internationally for the best deal for your money. But again, as long as you're making some profits on that, you are required to pay the taxes, and that's where that's where the trick it becomes a little tricky. And so obviously, again, for little people like you and I mean, those who make what, 50, 100, 150, $200,000, it just doesn't make sense to break the law and hide your assets or money from the banks. So my salary is not that high, and so my tax brackets or tax payments are big, but I mean, not that huge. And so for me, it doesn't make sense to try to park my money in a bank somewhere in Switzerland. Plus, because pretty much all my income is the salary that I receive as a professor, I mean, I wouldn't be able to hide it because the salary is paid officially and it's going through all the paperwork, so it would be very easy to see that I did gain that money. But when it becomes tricky, and so I'm kind of at the stage where it's becoming an issue for me, is that you sometimes do consulting on the side. Or if you're a lawyer, you may have, your clients, and you're basically self-employed if you have your firm, or you are a partner in the firm. Or if you're a doctor or entertainer or something of that kind, and so you basically work for yourself and you don't have a salary. So you make what you get from your contracts with your clients. So the challenge becomes that, let's say you have a company named A, right? And this company needs your services as a consultant. For example, in my case, it would be cross-cultural training for the employees. And let's say the company wants to pay me $20,000 for a 1-week training. And the challenge is that, or not the challenge, the temptation is that for the company, it doesn't matter who gets the money. They can pay it directly to me as Vast Harris, the private person, or they can pay it to my company if I had one, or it could pay the money to any other company that I say that is my company. And so the challenge is, or the temptation is, that I can register my company in, for example, Virgin Islands. And so I could say, well, please pay the money to, let's say, Teamwork Technologies, and this is the account number. And so I represent that company, and I will provide the consulting or entertainment or whatever else you do there. Now, the money goes to your company in the Virgin Islands, and because of the secrecy and protective nature of those jurisdictions, nobody in the United States really will know that you got that money. I mean, the money goes there. I mean, there are ways to trace your income, but generally it doesn't have to be associated with your name. So once the money goes there, you have a very good chance of hiding it there. I mean, nobody knowing that you have the money there. And so that's when the temptation arises. You kind of think, well, should I declare that income or should I not? And if I do declare that income, let's say it's $20,000, and let's say you're in 20% tax bracket, I mean, all of a sudden that's a few $1,000s that you would be paying in taxes if you show the money. And so, and then you think, well, I worked so hard for this money, and I don't really live in this country that much, and whatever else may be going through your head. And then you think, well, maybe I should just not mention about it. So those guys will keep my identity hidden, and nobody will know that that's my company that got that money, and they will just give me one of those nameless credit cards tied to my account that I can use here to charge, I don't know, my meals, grocery, whatever else I can charge. And nobody will ever know that I had that money, and maybe I shouldn't pay that tax. And again, with the amount of money that I make, it's definitely not worth it. But imagine that you're making $500,000 a year, or maybe $1 million a year, and many of you, I know, will be making that much. And many of you will be making that much being self-employed. So that's where it will become a little, tempting for you to perhaps, use those tax jurisdictions in havens in a questionable way. And again, and then you will also perhaps think that, well, the taxes are too low and they should be lowered, and maybe I should restore justice by stopping paying taxes on this end. And anyway, I'm not sure if you're going to get there, and I hope you won't, but that's basically how it works and where it starts. Now anyway, here is a question for you. And obviously the correct answer is D. All of the above are true. Now, I talked about how you can use an offshore account and should you use the offshore account. I would like just to repeat that there is nothing illegal about having money overseas. Uh, it is illegal not to pay taxes on capital gains from overseas jurisdictions, and so that's basically the idea. Now, what financial instruments that are traded internationally you know? Do you know what can be? Yeah. And so we're going to talk about international bond market, international equity market, Eurocurrency market, and currency interest trading. So we'll talk about each of those one by one. First, let's talk about Eurobonds. Just to help you on the exam, right here I would like to emphasize and underline and say clear and loud that Eurobonds have nothing to do with Europe as the region or Euro as the currency. You know what bonds are. Bonds are more or less loans, right? So I sell bonds. In a sense, I borrow money from you, and that piece of paper that I give to you signifies that you gave me your money. You gave me a loan, and the bond, that piece of paper, usually says how much money I will have to return to you and when. So if the bond is worth, let's say, $100, I would be promising, let's say, to repay you $110 in equal payments over the next whatever number of years the bond is issued for. And then obviously once you have that piece of paper, you can resell it if you want, and so there are all kinds of different bonds, but that's the idea. That's basically the loans. The challenge becomes if you want to issue or trade bonds internationally. So if you are a local government, for example, or an organization that wants to issue a bond, if you do it domestically, it's very easy. You want US dollars, and people who give you the money would give the money to you in the US dollars. And so that piece of paper will say that, you know, such and such student from Management 301 gives me $100, and I promise to repay the $100 plus $10 interest rates in the US dollars over this schedule. And you give the piece of paper, the bond, to the person, and the person gives you the money. And obviously it's not quite the same, it's not really giving the piece of paper, but that's the idea. Right? But what if somebody wants to buy your bond, and that somebody is from Japan, and that somebody has Japanese yen, not American dollars? So that's when it becomes a little trickier. And so it's okay to trade bonds internationally. So there are instruments that are specifically designed for international trading, so essentially international bonds. And those international bonds, that's what we call Eurobonds. And the reason we call them the Eurobonds is because the whole practice originated in Europe. And so that's where the term euro came from. But obviously today bonds are traded not only within Europe but all around the world. And so Eurobonds are the bonds that are sold in a country but are denominated in a currency that is not the currency of the country where they are sold. So for example, you may be buying bonds issued by a Japanese entity and buying them in the United States, and they may be denominated in Japanese yen, but they would be sold in the United States, and so we would call those bonds Euro bonds. And so the way they are regulated is different than the bonds issued in the US dollars and sold in the US dollars. In a sense, there is virtually no regulation. Well, there are some regulations, but not as much as there would be in the purely domestic market. And so in most cases what the governments say is that if you want to buy bonds from overseas using foreign currency, we're perfectly fine with that, but you're on your own. There will be little regulation, little oversight. It's going to be more risk for you because, you know, you don't know who those guys from Japan are who are selling you the bonds. So you may earn more because, you know, they're offering you, for example, higher returns, but at the same time you may lose everything, and we have nothing to do with that. And so because the market is less regulated, the lower regulations and the better, more competition basically makes those types of investments more attractive, but at the same time also more risky because, as I said, in the local context, in most cases there will be some governmental agencies that will be overseeing the bond market. But once you cross the border, you are more or less on your own, and your relationships with the investors or entities that issue bonds are those based on trust. International bond market, foreign bonds are pretty much like the like the Euro bonds, but they would be denominated in the currency of the country where they're sold. So a Japanese jurisdiction or a Canadian jurisdiction, entity, a company or a government may be selling bonds internationally, but even though the company may be a Japanese one, or the entity may be a Japanese one, they may be selling their bonds for American dollars in America. And as long as they're sold or denominated in American dollars, first, for American investors, that would be easy to buy them because you don't have to buy Japanese yen first. And second, it is also a little easier for the government here in the US to oversee the whole procedure. And so they would be not as heavily regulated and controlled as the purely domestic bond market, but again, a little bit more than the Eurobond market. And so those bonds even have funny names, like for example, the Japanese bonds sold overseas, not in Japan, would be called samurai bonds. And then, for example, British bonds sold overseas would be called bulldogs bonds. And then American bonds would be called Yankee bonds. And so again, American entities, and maybe even you will be chairing one of them one day, may be selling their loans or bonds overseas. And again, you will have a choice of denominating your bonds or financial instruments in either the currency of the country where you sell them, in which case they will be called foreign bonds, or in the currency of the country where you live, like for example in American dollars, or maybe even in the third country currency, but not the currency of the country where you sell them, and in that case they will be called Eurobonds. Now here is a question. Eurobonds are popular because, and obviously the answer is Eurobonds are popular because they're less regulated, and as a result they tend to yield higher returns on investment. But at the same time they're a little bit more risky, and so that's why they have the luxury of offering higher returns. Now this one is interesting. International interest rate rating. I'll give you a few examples from my personal life, and so they're kind of smaller time, so it's nothing about billions of dollars, but they illustrate these stories very well, how international interest rate trading works. The thing is that if you want to lend money or if you want to borrow money, you will see that interest rates in different countries are drastically different. As I said, in the United States, money today is cheap. You can borrow money for as little as 3-4% annually, and even lower if depending on what you need the money for. At the same time, if you want to lend money in the United States, you hardly ever will get more than 5-7% on your investment, which means if you want to make more money on your money, the United States is not the place to invest because interest rates are just too low. So as a result, you might want to shop around to either a loan or a borrower. And as you go internationally, you can see that, for example, here in the United States, the interest rates are low, and for example, in some countries like Barbados, they may be high. As I said, in Ukraine, they were fairly high last time when I went to Ukraine. The deposits in US dollars would be yielding somewhere between 15 to 18%, and the deposits in the local currency would be given up to 25-30% annual. Now imagine that I have some money in my pocket, and let's say, well, I just bought a house last year, and the house was $195,000, and I had some cash, but I had to borrow about $150,000. Now, the money that I had in my pocket, I could have put them in an account in Ukraine, and so at about 20% annual rate, that would give me a huge return. I mean, with the money I have, that would be more than enough to rent a beautiful house rather than buy one. And so that seemed like a good idea at that time. I'm kind of glad I didn't do it, though at the same time I'm thinking maybe that was a mistake. Here is the full story. In 2008, 2009, and even in 2010, interest rates in Ukraine were extremely high. And so the returns were very high if you wanted to invest your money there. But then once the crisis struck in 2008, the banks would make it very difficult for you to withdraw your money. You would see your money on your account when you log into your account, but you would not be allowed to get more than, let's say, $200 a day, and there were different times different banks would offer different limits. And so that was kind of terrible. So for example, I bought my first house here in Greensboro in 2009. And so I luckily had enough cash for that one, and still unfortunately cannot sell it now. I bought the second one, but still have this first one and trying to sell it now. But anyway, at that time I had a fairly large amount of cash in my pocket, like a six-figure amount of cash in my pocket. And so had I invested it in a bank in Ukraine, by now my wealth pretty much would have doubled. But at the same time, had I need that money for, let's say, buying my second house in 2009 or 2010, I wouldn't be allowed to withdraw all that money at once. And so eventually now apparently there is again no limit on withdrawal and you can get all your cash at once, but there were a couple of years when you couldn't do it. And so that was very frustrating. And so if had I invested the money in 2008 as I planned, I wouldn't be able to buy the wonderful house that I bought a couple of years later. My distant relative, for example, has a company that installs traffic lights and all kinds of traffic related equipment. And so his challenge was that in 2009, 2010, 2008, even more so, he would be, for example, getting payments from his clients. He would see the money on his account, but he would not be allowed to use the money to pay the wages, the salary to his employees. And so that was an absurd situation. He writes the check, the employees get the check, they come to the bank, but they cannot cash it because there is a limit of, let's say, $100 or $200 per withdrawal per day. And so that was kind of a frustrating situation, and so obviously that was not very much help in the business. But then at the same time, again, if you're a private individual and you need your money for something, you wouldn't be able to get it back. There was, for example, this one story in my hometown. An older guy got sick and his wife was sick and died, something like that, and he had the money for the operation or for the surgery that he needed in his account, but the bank wouldn't give it to him. And so as a protest, he sprayed himself with gasoline and burned himself in the bank office. Terrible things. And eventually he survived, and so the bank agreed to give him, I believe, half of his cash right away and then the rest over the next few weeks, something like that. But then again, the situation stabilized, and so if I didn't need the money during that period, I would now have pretty much twice as much cash in my pocket as I did just a few years ago. So again, obviously it is tricky, but risky, but it is interesting. Now here is your question, and the correct answer is foreign bonds, B. Now the same story applies to international equity market. So not only you can shop for the best loan terms or for the best financial instruments, you can also buy or sell companies internationally, and that makes a huge difference. First, let's say you have a wonderful company called XYZ Incorporated, and you want to raise some capital. You want to sell shares of your company so that you can have more cash on hand, so you can expand your operations and make even more profits. Now let's say you decided to sell a company, as most people do, in the United States. You want to list it on a local trade exchange, local stock market. And the problem is that most Americans, for some reason, I don't know, don't have much money. The crisis hit them really hard, and they don't have enough money to buy shares of a wonderful company. So that's the problem. The thing is that if you decided to open up and accept bids from foreign buyers, you can raise much more capital. How much more? Well, potentially hugely more. Here is a story, for example, from Ukraine. At some time it was the largest steel mill in the world. Now it is the second largest steel mill in the world. Called, and you can probably not pronounce that name, the company is called Stal. Anyway, one of the largest steel mills in the world, huge, built during the Soviet era, and so that's where the steel for all those tanks and airplanes was coming from. So, but anyway, that company was up for privatization in 2004, or 2003 actually. And so the shares of that state-owned company were sold only on the domestic market. The company was sold for $800 million, which is virtually nothing. I mean, $800 million for one of the largest companies in the world. I mean, come on, like Facebook is worth who knows how much more. And here we have a company that makes actually very tangible, very real product, steel. And there is lots of demand for steel these days, as you know. China, India, lots of construction going on worldwide. So, but anyway, all they could raise domestically was $800 million. Then a new president is elected, and one of his promises was that he would renationalize the company and then go through a re-privatization, but this time will allow bidders to bid, come from overseas and bid for the company. And so this is what they do. So I believe at that time the company had been privatized for about half a year. They reach a settlement with the new owner, pay him or her the money back. I believe they actually paid some penalties for basically renationalizing the company. But anyway, this time they try to sell the company on the open market, and so they invite bidders from all around the world. And this guy, I'm not sure if you know his name is actually Middle Steel. Has nothing to do, I mean, kind of funny that his name is Middle Steel. He's in the steel business, but that's his real name. That's not some form of nickname. But anyway, he eventually wins the auction, and so he eventually becomes the new owner of the company. So he buys the shares for $4.8 billion, which is 6 times as much money as the original capital raised on the domestic stock market. So which means that by simply going international, by simply inviting buyers from all around the world, the Ukrainian government was able to raise 6 times as much capital as they could domestically. So for your wonderful XYZ Incorporated company, if you were able to sell your shares internationally, you would most likely find buyers overseas who would be willing to pay more than whatever the local guys are willing to pay for your company. So for you as the company owner that seeks to sell some shares of your company, that is definitely a wonderful proposition. But so it is for you if you want to buy companies. So let's say you don't like any local company. Let's say you don't believe that Apple shares will continue growing as they have in the past few years. Let's say you don't think that Google or whatever else company will not be as profitable in the future as it was before. But at the same time, you may think that, for example, Baidu, the Chinese equivalent of Google, will grow and will increase in value, and so you can probably make more money on those investments. So if you as an investor go international, all of a sudden you have many more options to buy, and so maybe your analysis shows that some of those international options are going to be much more profitable than whatever you have domestically. So everyone seems to win in this case, and capital moves more freely into where it's needed most. Finally, Eurocurrency market. This one is and so the idea here is that you can have an account here in the United States that would be operating in a foreign currency. Most American banks would allow you to have a foreign currency account, or what we call Eurocurrency account. You can have an account that would be basically, for example, in Canadian dollars. I had one of those accounts in Canada. I was frequently traveling to the United States, and so my bank would allow me to have an account in the US dollars, and I would use that account to first put my payments from American clients into that account. So every time I would do some consulting in the United States, the payment would be in the US dollars. And for a number of reasons, I didn't want to exchange the US dollars into Canadian dollars right away, because I knew I would be coming back to the United States one day, and I may need that money for my purchases. So by changing it back to Canadian dollars and then again back to the US dollars would basically mean that I every time would lose 3-4% on the exchange rate, and so by changing it back and forth I may be losing a lot of money. So my bank would allow me to have an account that is denominated in the US dollars, and I would just put my American dollars in my American dollar account in a Canadian bank, and when I need that money in the US, I would just pay directly with the US dollars, like my credit bills or whatever else I would need to pay for in the United States. And so that obviously makes it very convenient, but at the same time it's perfectly legal. There is absolutely no problem with that, again, as long as you're paying your taxes and capital gains. And again, the euro currency here has nothing to do with euro as the currency. So euro currency just signifies that you are operating in a different currency that is not local to the country where you're operating. And so it's a huge market valued at around $7 trillion internationally, and it just means that people have currencies of other countries in their accounts or pockets, and it's a lot of money. And obviously, again, maybe even some of you have foreign currency in your account, which in this case would be called Eurocurrency if you have it in the United States. Now, let's talk about foreign exchange market. So we're going to talk about conversion rates, and you want to know what that is, right? We'll talk about hedging, arbitrage, and speculation. So first, arbitrage. This is a fascinating topic. I mean, arbitrage is wonderful and beautiful, and at the same time little known, or at least as the term, many people don't really know what it means. We'll talk about three different types of arbitrage: price arbitrage, interest arbitrage, and exchange rate arbitrage. Um, I have a slide for each of the types. I'll actually let me talk about each of them first, and then I'll have a slide for each of them separately. First, price arbitrage. That's the classic example. What that is arbitrage in general first, is an instantaneous purchase and reselling of certain assets, and it can be of products or services or currencies or interest rates, or whatever else may be the case. And so the way it works is that sometimes as you shop around, you may see that the same product cost differently in different places. And so you can buy it where it's cheaper and resell it right away in where it's more expensive, and basically make some profits on that price difference. And so that's basically what the price arbitrage is. Let's say, I'll give you an example that my wife is ashamed of, but I remember there was a time when she was bragging about that some time ago, like 10 years ago, when we were still poor students. And even though the example is kind of ethically questionable in a sense, but it's a perfect example of price arbitrage. And so here's the story. Just don't tell anyone. But anyway, one day my wife comes to me and says that she made $3 effectively on price arbitrage. And the way she made those $3 is this. She goes to Walmart and sees that there is some kind of product there. Let's say, I don't know, shampoo that is sold there for, let's say, $3 a bottle. And then she continues shopping, and then she goes, let's say, to Target, and she sees that the same shampoo there is sold for $2, so $1 cheaper. Now, knowing that Walmart would accept returns even if you don't have the receipt, what she does is she buys 3 bottles of that shampoo at $2 a bottle at Target, crosses the street, goes to Walmart, and in a sense returns or resells it to Walmart at $3 a bottle. And so by doing so, she makes $3. And again, it was only once, and she did it only like when she was, I don't know, it was 2001 or something like that in Dallas. But that's the idea. And obviously, if you do it on a large scale, you can make a lot of money. For example, you figure that, let's say, I don't know, oil is more expensive in Canada than it is in the United States for some reason, or gas. And so what you can do is you can buy 10 million gallons of gas for, let's say, I don't know, $3 a gallon here, and then resell it in Canada where oil is more expensive at the same very moment, or once you can transport it there for $3.50 a gallon. And so once you do it, you can live on that extra difference. And so that's the basic, very simple and primitive idea of how it works. Now, interest arbitrage is the same idea, but here you would be shopping for interest, and so that becomes a little bit more interesting. Again, I'll give you a specific example to illustrate how it works. Imagine that you find a country or a bank that is willing to lend you money at 4% a year. Now, imagine that you also find a bank in, for example, somewhere in Ukraine that is willing to take your money for 5% a year. So what you can do is you can borrow a lot of money from this bank, put it in that bank, and because there is 1% difference, whatever the bank B will be paying you in interest, you will be paying back to bank A to service your loan, but then there will be 1% left in your pocket, and that's what you live on. I'll give you a specific story of how it works. A friend of mine from Ukraine has a house in Ukraine. And so he moves to the United States to study. He's actually doing his PhD degree here at the Bryan School of Business. Now, he decides to buy a house here, and he does buy a house, and his plan is to sell his house in Ukraine and use the money to pay for the house here in Greensboro. And houses in Ukraine are probably about the same price as they are in Greensboro. Greensboro is very cheap in terms of housing prices. He was in Kiev, capital of Ukraine, so prices there were actually higher than what they are here in Greensboro. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The thing is that sometime later he actually sells his house in Ukraine, and now he has all that money sitting in his account in Ukraine. And at the time when he was planning to take that money and pay off his mortgage for the house here in Greensboro, he actually checks the interest rates. And so his interest rate here in Greensboro is 4.5% or something like that. Let's say 4% just to keep it even. Now, the Ukrainian bank pays him 20% on the money that he has in the account there. So the difference is 16%. And the guy figures, oh, this is a wonderful arbitrage opportunity. I'm not going to pay off my loan here so I can save 4%. I'm going to keep my money in the Ukrainian bank, collect my interest rates or interest, which is 20% of my total investment, use that interest rates to pay my mortgage payments here, and I will still have 16% left in the end of the day as my basically profit. And it is somewhat risky because, you know, as I said, sometimes Ukrainian banks play those games where they wouldn't give you the money back. But as long as the system works, the difference in interest rates present a wonderful earning opportunity. And so that's what the interest rate arbitrage is. And then finally, exchange rate. Again, local currencies tend to be more expensive in the countries where, you know, they are local. Like, for example, American dollar is always more expensive in the United States than it is in Canada. And vice versa, Canadian dollar is always more expensive in Canada than it is elsewhere. And so occasionally you can see a situation where, for example, you can buy Canadian dollar for 105 American dollar here, but you can sell it for 106 somewhere else. And so what you can do, let's say you have $1 million in your pocket, you buy quickly from this market $1 million worth of Canadian dollar for 105, for example, and resell it the same instance or a few minutes later in a market where the price in Canadian dollar is higher. So once you identify those arbitrage opportunities, and if you can move the money quickly, buy and sell right away for profit, you can make some profit. And again, usually it would be a fraction of a percent, but if you have lots of cash, that fraction of a percent can give you a few $100,000 or a few $1,000s in a matter of a few minutes. Not bad at all. And so that's basically the idea. So price arbitrage, interest arbitrage, and exchange rate arbitrage. Now here's a question just to make sure that you understand how it works. Interest arbitrage and obviously the correct answer would be B, the profit-motivated purchase and sale of interest-paying securities denominated in different currencies. Cross rates, I'm not going to talk about that. You understand this idea. Currency values, again, simple math. If you don't understand that, just look at the slides. Now, in terms of exchanging currencies, again, kind of micro-level type of stuff. Imagine that you are going overseas and you want to buy some foreign currency. Turns out that it's more complicated, or there is more to know here than what a normal human being knows. Most people, what they do is they just come to that exchange booth in the airport and change their currencies. Normally they would see a picture that looks like this. For example, if you're buying Canadian dollars, you would need to pay 95 cents per dollar. If you're selling Canadian dollars, you will get 88 cents per dollar. And the figures are a little outdated. Today the Canadian dollar is roughly 1-to-1 with the American dollar. But as you can see here, there is about a 3%, 4%, 2% depending on the location. But there is a certain fee that you essentially have to pay, because every time you sell you get less, every time you buy you pay more. And this is how the banks make their money. But it turns out that there are different ways to buy currencies. First of all, the difference between so-called buy rate and sell rate, and then spot rate. So buy-sell rates these are the rates that you would see at those banks or exchange booths. So, and as you see, there is roughly a 3% charge for buying and selling currency. Now, when banks buy and sell currencies to one another, unlike people, they're not really buying and selling, they're exchanging currencies. And so their exchange would be done at so-called spot rate, which is a point roughly right in the middle between the buy and sell rate. So if you have lots of American dollars and you need lots of euros, and you're a bank, you just find a bank somewhere else that needs lots of American dollars but has excess euros, and you would be swapping those currencies in a sense. And so you would be using the spot rate. Now, sometimes banks, given that, you know, this is how much they pay for the foreign currency, they would offer spot rates to some of their most important clients. So So traders, but then also big clients may sometimes get those spot rates. But that's just so you know. So when, for example, the news reports are out on the radio, you're driving and you're listening to the exchange rates on the news report, they would be actually giving you the spot rate, not buy and sell rate. You understand that? So that's one thing. Second, and so obviously there is a big difference. So for example, if we take the Canadian dollar, let's just see what the rates today are. So the spot rate today, Canadian dollar is 101 American dollar, so virtually 1-to-1. But if I go and look at the sell rate today, and I'm going to Canadian Bank, so as you see the difference is 104 versus 98. So the spot rate is right in the middle, 101, close to 102. But if you want to buy, you would have to pay 2 cents more for each dollar. If you want to sell, you would lose 2 cents in each dollar. So it seems like the price of exchanging currency at the buy-sell rate is about 2%. And if you have to do it back and forth all the time, you would be losing lots of money. Now, there are alternative sources or ways to buy currency, and so there are all of those different online traders who sell in huge volumes. Like for example, Oanda is one of them, and there are many other ones. These guys normally operate for a fixed fee. Regardless of how much you buy or sell, they would be giving you or charging you a fixed fee. Like these guys, they charge, if I remember correctly, $25. But then again, sometimes when you need the money right away and you don't have the time to go to all those websites and buy and sell there, your only option may be over-the-counter purchase, and in that case you would be paying more. But again, if we went with, for example, US and wanted to buy Canadian dollar, let's see what rate we would get, and let's say we wanted to buy $100,000, all right? So let's see how much we would be getting. So their rate is a little better, right? And they have a 25% fee. And so as a result, you would be saving substantial, well, actually not that much money with these guys, actually. So you would be paying $98,000. Well, if I went with $100, so actually it seems like you wouldn't be saving much. So it makes sense to use these guys, particularly these guys with a larger amount of money. But again, many of these online traders would give you a very good deal, and in many cases they would have only a very small fee that you would pay for the whole purchase. And so in my case, for example, the last time when I changed a large amount of money, that was buying a house here in the United States using the money from Canada, that was a huge issue. I was exchanging about $100,000 at that time. And so with $100,000, you know, like a fraction of a percent makes a lot of difference. And so I seriously considered going with one of these online traders, and many of them seem to have a very good reputation. And so you could save, you know, you could get close to a spot rate with those guys. And so a spot rate, you know, with $100,000, you get $2,000 saved right there. A lot of money for, you know, nothing. In my case, I admit I did go with a traditional exchange, with a traditional bank. And the reason for that is I figured if I lose $2,000 on a not so good exchange rate, I could survive. It's not going to make me much poorer. But if something goes wrong, for example, and the money just disappears somewhere in the transaction, since it's an online trader, I wouldn't even know where to go to, you know, claim my money. And so I thought if I lose all of it, that would be a trick. But again, I did some research since then, and it seems like these online traders actually have very good reputation, and they seem to do their job very well. On top of that, what you can do, and that's actually what I did in my case, it was a traditional bank, but what I did, I went with what's so-called US borderless plan. What that is it's a US denominated account in my Canadian bank, and there is a service fee for that account. I believe I had to pay $10 a month, but it would give you a better exchange rate within that account if you want to, in this specific case, exchange Canadian dollars for the US dollars. And you can definitely get the same thing for just about any currency. And as you can see here, I had to buy American dollars, right? And so to buy American dollars at the regular rate, I would be paying 104 Canadian dollars for each American dollar. But if I had the borderless plan, I would be paying only 103, which in my case at that time already didn't have the borderless plan. But I specifically opened it for a few weeks just to have that one transaction, and so I was saving 1%, and with the amount of money I had played at that time, it was about $1,000 right there. And so the same thing applies to other currencies, and you can have accounts in other currencies. Again, obviously this kind of exchange requires some advanced planning, and so if you find yourself at an airport and you just need to buy $20 to buy burger at the airport. Obviously, at that stage, you don't want to go with all those complicated schemes. But if you run a company, and many of you will be running a company, I know you will, and so let's say you need to buy a combine or a tractor or some heavy equipment for your factory, and the price is $2 million. All of a sudden, that fraction of a percent that you can save by going a different route to exchange your rates, that's a big deal. Let's say you would be buying, I don't know, some kind of robot, industrial robot from Japan at the price of $2 million, and you have to pay with the Japanese yen. So that's when those exchange rates really, really matter. But then again, smaller amounts that you're exchanging now as a private individual, well, at this time, $7, maybe $30 on the exchange rate is a big deal for you. And if it is, maybe you want to do some shopping around. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, it may matter where you buy in. So as I said, you have all these different situations. And so you can go with a bank. And in that case, if you have $100,000 exchange proposition, you may easily be losing up to $4,000 if you go with the traditional bank. Then you can also approach brokers, and so those guys can offer you better rates. Or if you go with the specific, online trader, or there are many of them actually, you can save a lot of money down the road. Now, how can you minimize risks associated with currency fluctuation? So your take-home assignment, for example, the one on when the two countries become one, and use one currency, well, obviously one thing that you win is that you remove that uncertainty related to currency rate fluctuations from the picture. Let's say you want to buy something from Canada. Let's say you want to buy, I don't know, 10 million barrels of oil from a Canadian oil producer. The thing is that you don't need that oil right now, you need it in 3 months, and you have enough cash to pay for that oil now. Now, you don't want to pay for it now because you will be getting the product only 3 months from now, so obviously you want to keep the money till the last day. The problem is that the Canadian dollar seems to be appreciating against the American dollar, and so as a result, you are worried that if you wait for 3 months, whatever the US dollars you have today may not be sufficient to buy the needed amount or number of Canadian dollars 3 months from now. And so obviously that creates uncertainty for you, that obviously makes it kind of riskier for you, and so you don't know what you want to do. Should you pay just now so you don't have to deal with that, in which case you will definitely lose some interest because you could have kept that money for 3 extra months in an account and earned some interest, or you should just take the risk and wait. And so that definitely creates that uncertainty and makes your trade more difficult. And so there are all kinds of ways you can protect yourself against all those fluctuations. One obviously is a forward rate or forward contract. So you can approach your bank and say that in 3 months you will be buying Canadian dollars, or whatever currency you will be buying. And the bank will often agree to give you a specific exchange rate, or promise you an exchange rate at that specific time, and that will when the transaction will happen, but the exchange rate will be fixed today. Now, the bank obviously wants to protect itself against uncertainties and fluctuations, and so the rate that you will get fixed today will probably be not as good as what you could have gotten otherwise. But at the same time, if the rate is good enough for you, you'll at least know that if for some reason the American dollar drops dramatically, another crisis hits or something else, you will not be paying more than whatever you agreed upon today. So there is some cost associated with that, but it's like insurance. You know that you will pay something, but you know how much you will pay, and no matter what else happens, you will never pay more than whatever you agreed upon from the beginning. Now, there are different versions of this, and so some of them would be currency futures contract or currency option. And so the kind of currency contract is more or less the same, but currency option is a little different. Again, the rate may be fixed today, but you may be given a choice of whether or not you will buy the currency at that rate on a given date. So with a forward rate or forward contract, you will be obliged to make that purchase on that date. With the option, you will look at the exchange rates on that day, and if the exchange rates moved in your favor, you will say, well, sorry guys, I'm not going to use my option, I'm not going to buy it now, I'll just go with the standard rate because it's better than what I get. With the option, obviously, again, there is a price associated with that, and so the bank will probably give you a rate that is not very attractive, and there may be even a fixed fee associated with that rate. But again, it may be a wonderful option for you because, again, if the market moves in your favor, you can always opt out and still save. If it goes terribly bad, well, you know how much it costs, and still it may be a good option for you. And then currency swap, again, especially for larger traders, that may be a wonderful opportunity, but again, usually that's for bigger traders. Now, in terms of where you can buy currencies, well, over-the-counter market, and that's what we discussed. That's what most people like you and I go to buy currencies. Then securities exchange and interbank market, and so these are primarily preserved for traders and banks, and so that's where the big guys trade currencies. Again, just something to keep in mind. I don't think there will be an exam question about this. Now, why some currencies are freely traded and some are not? And I'll give you a few more stories so you know that. So, for example, why you can go to an American bank and easily buy euros or Canadian dollars, but you can't easily buy, for example, Ukrainian hryvnias? Well, there are all kinds of reasons why governments sometimes make it difficult or impossible to trade currencies. Well, one of the problems is that some governments are protectionist. And we talked in the previous lectures about protectionism and reasons for why governments might want you to buy local products and not products made in overseas or made in somewhere else. The governments can impose all kinds of restrictions, and we talked about, for example, import tariffs, but also currency restrictions. So the government may not be allowed, for example, to impose import tariffs because the government or the country may be a member of the World Trade Organization, and they would not be allowed to discriminate that way. But what they can do is they can make for their citizens to buy foreign currencies very difficult. And so Ukraine in the 90s, when I still worked there, was very much like that. I worked for a company that was buying and selling agricultural equipment, and I was responsible for supplies from several countries. Like, for example, machines like this one. This one, it's a potato seeder, so that's basically a machine that plants potatoes. But again, there are many machines like that. Actually, this one is not a potato planter. That's just regular seeder. So seeds of your canola or soybeans or whatever else you want to seed. And so every time I wanted to buy one of those machines, this particular one is from Norway. Company name is Cornland. So, but anyway, every time I wanted to buy one of those machines, we would first have to buy, at that time would be Norwegian krones, or if it was from Germany, then Deutsche Marks. I believe it was still before euros. And so the problem is that even though we were fine with whatever import tariffs we would pay and the client was fine with the price, it was a very big problem to buy that foreign currency. So we would have to file a special application where we would attach the copy of the contract. And so there were all kinds of things, like this many papers that we would have to submit just to buy those $100,000 for a machine like this. Actually, a machine like this is more like $40,000. And so that was the challenge. And so by making it difficult for us to get foreign currency, the government was basically encouraging us and the customers to buy more of the local stuff. And does it help or not? Well, I'm very much anti-protectionist. I believe that free market, free trade is definitely much more, not believe, I have empirical evidence that tells me that free trade is much more beneficial for everyone involved than protectionist policies. But again, sometimes governments may feel that protectionism is a solution in the short run, and so they may limit your ability to buy foreign currencies so that they protect domestic producers. Another possible reason may be that the government doesn't want to encourage inflation, and so they would make it impossible for you to buy foreign currencies, thereby stimulating demand for the local currency and thereby making local currency more sought after, and so people would be less willing to sell it for whatever price they can sell, and so that keeps the price of the currency high, which keeps the prices of products low. And so sometimes when the country is poor or not industrialized yet, or developing country, sometimes unfortunately people, or I guess normally, not unfortunately, normally, once they get their paycheck, they're trying to buy foreign currency right away because they're afraid that their own currency will lose value. And so by making it difficult for them to buy foreign currencies, the government basically forces people to keep the local currency in their pocket, and as a result demand for local currency increases, and so the local currency buys more products, which in a sense limits inflation. And so obviously then also corruption and self-benefit. I mean, if the government restricts foreign currency purchase, then and decides who gets the right to buy foreign currency and who doesn't, that creates a wonderful opportunity for bribes. I mean, yeah, who's gonna buy currency today? Well, let's see who needs it more. And then obviously somebody approaches you with a case of cash, and you say, oh, these guys need currency, foreign currency very much, and so here is your right to buy foreign currency, and you know you will not be able to buy unless maybe you approach me with also some sort of a bribe. And so obviously when something like this is happening, then there is a whole industry black market of foreign currency. Like for example, this is a guy in my hometown trying to buy and sell foreign currency, and they would be literally standing on the crossroads and kind of walking around and saying things like rubli, dolary, marочки, rubli, dolary, marочки, which means rubles, dollars, Deutsche marks, or now I guess euros. And so if you need to buy currency, the banks wouldn't sell them to you, so you go to some of these guys, and their interest rates would be a little higher, or exchange rates would be higher. But again, if that's your only option, well, that's your only option. And then occasionally there would be a police raid, and these guys just disappear right away. And so kind of interesting market. I was buying and selling cars in the 90s from Germany to Germany, and I was exchanging currencies a lot, obviously. And so I first would be dealing with these guys, but then over time, as I was exchanging bigger amounts of money, I would actually be going to their bosses. And so normally kind of the little guys stand on the street, but their bosses who trade larger amounts would be sitting in a nearby restaurant and would be selling currencies only to those whom they know personally. And so over time, when I became a regular client, I was kind of promoted, and so instead of going and buying money on the street, and you can imagine like $40,000 counted on the street, that's almost dangerous and not very wise. So I would be going directly to the big time traders, and again, that's all black market. And so sit at the restaurant with them, do the exchanges there. They would give me somewhat better rate, and so that's safer and works better. And by the way, that may sound to you like like who needs that? I mean, why would I worry about that? That's for that guy from a developing country. But no, you will be doing business over the entire planet, and there is a very good chance you will be doing business somewhere. While Ukraine is more developed today than it was in the 90s, but let's say you will be doing business in Congo or in Zimbabwe or in China, who knows where, right? And so markets are not saturated there, so you can make a lot of money there, lots of demand. But at the same time, to do business there, you would need local currency, and there is a very good chance local currency will not be available to you, or your currency will not be available to the locals. And there is a very good chance this is how you will be doing your business. 100,000 here and there, changed somewhere in the restaurant by your representatives. And so there is a very good chance this is how you will be making your first $1 million. Because that's definitely, well, I never made $1 million, but that's how I was doing my business. And so if I had to go now and do business somewhere in Africa or Latin America or Asia, this is pretty much how I would need to do much of my currency exchange and stuff like that. And again, maybe banks will be your option, but there is a good chance that they will not be. And so if you want to make money, well, that may be. I mean, believe me, even the largest companies, like believe me, McDonald's, when they enter a market that is not very developed, and when they regulate all those payments, I have no doubt that in some countries this is how they trade currencies. Finally, again, sometimes the government may need the hard currency or freely traded currency to repay their debt. And so what they would do is they would just basically, they know that if the currencies were freely traded in their country, all the national reserves of foreign currencies would be bought out right away by the local citizens. So they would specifically make it impossible for the locals to buy the foreign currency, so that whatever foreign currency the government receives is used to service its debt. And so occasionally that happens, particularly in the countries where inflation is huge, like for example in the 90s in Ukraine, inflation would be reaching up to 10,000% a year. Like I was a millionaire. In fact, there were times when inflation was so huge that I would be making $1 million per week, well, local dollars that wouldn't be worth much. But inflation actually was so huge at that time, like 93 and 94, that salaries, I mean, like payments were made. Your salary would be paid to you twice a day, and so you would get your first paycheck around lunch, and you go and try to spend it all during lunch, because you know that by the end of the day it will be worth like half of what it's worth at noon. And whatever you get paid at 5 p.m. you try to spend by next morning, because if you don't, again, prices will be growing like 10-20% every day. Like that was a terrible time. But again, other times like that, whatever currency, foreign currency is available in the country, people just try to buy it right away. And sometimes the government needs that foreign currency, and so they would impose all kinds of restrictions so you can't buy the foreign currency. Anyway, here is your question. And the correct answer is 4, right? And this is what you need to know on the exam. So again, as always, I guarantee you there will be nothing on the exam that is not covered on this slide. Obviously, you have to have good understanding of each of these topics, but as long as you do, you will do well on the exam. Thank you, and stop.